In my years observing the turbulent politics of our age, I have witnessed how swiftly the foundations of civilization can crumble when abstract theory displaces accumulated wisdom. The French revolutionaries, drunk on the intoxicating promises of universal reason, destroyed in mere months what centuries of careful development had built. Yet here in America, you face similar temptations, the allure of sweeping transformation, the promise that complex problems yield to simple solutions, the dangerous belief that human nature itself can be remade by legislative decree. What separates the American experiment from the French catastrophe? Constitutional order. Not the parchment itself, but the living tradition of prudent governance, respect for precedent, and understanding that liberty flourishes only within carefully maintained boundaries. Today, I shall reveal why the difference between revolution and reform, between ordered freedom and anarchic license, determines whether a nation preserves its heritage or destroys its future. The lessons of France's tragic descent into terror illuminate the eternal choice every free people must make: constitutional wisdom or revolutionary folly. Chapter 1: The Fatal Attraction of Abstract Theory. Nothing so destroys sound judgment as the intoxication of pure theory divorced from human experience. The French philosophes, brilliant though they were, committed the cardinal error of believing that government could be constructed like a mathematical theorem, clean, logical, universal. They dismissed the messy complexities of history as mere prejudice, the accumulated wisdom of generations as superstition. How different their approach from the practical statesmanship that built England's constitutional system through centuries of careful adjustment. I watched with growing alarm as these intellectual architects drew their blueprints for human society with no more regard for existing institutions than a builder might show for the dwellings he demolishes. The Declaration of the Rights of Man reads beautifully, abstract principles that appeal to every generous heart. Yet observe how swiftly these noble abstractions became instruments of tyranny. When you declare that all authority derives from popular will alone, you destroy every intermediate institution that actually protects popular freedom. The revolutionaries proclaimed the sovereignty of reason, yet their reason recognized no limits. They would remake religion, abolish ancient provinces, restructure society itself according to geometric precision. This is not reason but rationalism, the worship of human logic as if it were divine omniscience. True reason, the kind that builds lasting institutions, acknowledges its own limitations. It recognizes that human affairs are too complex for any single mind to comprehend fully. Consider the contrast with your own revolution. The American founders, though they appealed to natural rights, built upon English constitutional precedents. They did not destroy colonial institutions wholesale but adapted them. They recognized that liberty requires not just popular will but constitutional structure, separation of powers, federalism, an independent judiciary. They understood what the French forgot, that freedom is not the absence of restraint but the presence of just law. The French mistake echoes through every revolutionary movement since. The promise is always the same: sweep away the old, construct the new according to rational principles, achieve perfection through human will. The result is always similar: the destruction of protective institutions followed by the concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands. Abstract theory, no matter how elegant, cannot substitute for the patient work of constitutional development. Chapter 2: How Revolution Devours Constitutional Tradition. The most tragic aspect of the French Revolution was not its initial violence but its systematic destruction of every constitutional barrier between popular passion and unlimited power. In their zeal to eliminate aristocratic privilege, the revolutionaries dismantled the very institutions that had evolved to check arbitrary authority: provincial parliaments, ancient corporations, even the complex relationships between crown, nobility, and commons that, however imperfect, provided multiple centers of power. Observe the pattern. First, they abolished the parliaments that had historically resisted royal absolutism. Then they eliminated provincial distinctions that had preserved local liberties. Next, they destroyed guilds and corporations that gave workers and merchants organized voice in public affairs. Finally, they attacked the church, which had provided moral authority independent of state power. Each destruction was justified by appealing to popular sovereignty, yet each removal of constitutional obstacles left the people more exposed to tyrannical control. This reveals a fundamental truth about constitutional government: it protects liberty not through parchment declarations but through institutional complexity. The very inefficiencies that revolutionaries despise, overlapping jurisdictions, ancient privileges, competing authorities, these create the spaces within which freedom flourishes. When you simplify government to express pure popular will, you paradoxically make that will easier to manipulate and control. The English Constitution, which I spent decades defending in Parliament, never claimed perfection. Its strength lay precisely in its organic development, its ability to adapt without destroying its essential character. Our Constitution balanced Crown, Lords, and Commons not through theoretical elegance but through practical experience of what each element contributed to good government. The King provided executive energy, the Lords offered stability and wisdom, the Commons supplied popular legitimacy, yet none could govern alone. The French rejected such complexity as irrational. They would have government express pure popular will without institutional mediation. Yet what is popular will without constitutional structure? It becomes whatever the most organized faction claims it to be. The Jacobins spoke for the people, while destroying every institution through which actual people had exercised political influence. This is why constitutional order matters more than constitutional theory. Written constitutions, however carefully crafted, mean nothing without the living traditions that interpret and apply them. The Americans understood this. Their constitution succeeded because it built upon colonial experience of self-government, English legal tradition, and Protestant habits of covenant-making. The French Constitution failed because it rejected all precedent in favor of abstract principle. Constitutional government requires what I call the prejudices of a people, their inherited assumptions about proper authority, legitimate resistance, individual rights, and social obligations. These prejudices, refined by experience, provide the cultural foundation that makes constitutional law possible. Chapter 3: The Illusion of Popular Sovereignty Without Representation. The French revolutionaries proclaimed themselves champions of popular sovereignty, yet they created the most systematic betrayal of genuine representation in modern history. They confused the will of the people with the will of their self-appointed spokesman, mistaking the voice of organized factions for the voice of the nation. This confusion reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of political representation that threatens every democratic society. True representation, as I learned through decades in Parliament, involves far more than mechanical delegation of popular preferences. A representative serves not merely as a conduit for constituent demands but as a trustee of the broader public interest. He must consider not only what his constituents want today but what the nation needs for tomorrow. He must balance local interests against national requirements, immediate desires against long-term consequences, popular passion against constitutional principle. The revolutionary assemblies in France rejected this understanding of representation. They claimed to embody popular will directly, without the mediating wisdom that true representation provides. Deputies were instructed mandates, bound to execute the predetermined will of their constituencies rather than deliberate about the common good. This reduced representation to mere delegation, eliminating the space for prudent judgment that effective governance requires. Consider how different this approach from the principles underlying your own House of Representatives. American representatives, like British MPs, are chosen by local constituencies but charged with national responsibilities. They must answer to voters, yet they retain the freedom to exercise judgment about what policies best serve the general welfare. This creative tension between local accountability and national perspective enables representative government to function effectively. The French mistake was believing that democracy means the immediate expression of popular will rather than its thoughtful refinement through representative institutions. They wanted government by the people to mean government as the people, eliminating the distance necessary for wise deliberation. Yet pure democracy, as the ancients understood, inevitably becomes mob rule because it lacks institutional mechanisms for transforming passion into policy. True popular sovereignty requires constitutional structures that enable the people to govern themselves indirectly through representatives who possess both accountability and independence. The people must be able to choose their governors and remove them periodically, yet those governors must have sufficient authority and tenure to exercise judgment about complex public questions. This is why the destruction of traditional representative institutions during the French Revolution proved so catastrophic. The revolutionaries claimed to give power directly to the people, yet they actually concentrated it in the hands of whoever could most effectively claim to speak for popular will. Without constitutional checks on claims to represent the people, representation becomes indistinguishable from demagogy. Chapter 4: The Economics of Revolutionary Destruction versus Constitutional Commerce. Nothing reveals the fundamental difference between revolutionary folly and constitutional wisdom more clearly than their contrasting approaches to economic life. The French revolutionaries, intoxicated by abstract theories of equality, systematically destroyed the complex economic institutions that had evolved to serve both efficiency and social stability. They eliminated guilds, confiscated property, manipulated currency, and imposed maximum prices, each measure justified by appeals to popular welfare, yet each contributing to economic catastrophe. The revolutionaries viewed existing economic arrangements as mere expressions of aristocratic privilege rather than evolved solutions to practical problems. Guilds, which had developed over centuries to maintain quality standards, provide worker training, and offer mutual support during economic hardship, were abolished as impediments to free labor. Ancient property rights, which provided security for productive investment, were violated whenever revolutionary necessity demanded. Commercial law, which had gradually developed to facilitate trade while protecting all parties, was subordinated to political ideology. Observe the consequences: economic production collapsed, currency became worthless, trade networks disintegrated, and the very people the revolution claimed to serve suffered unprecedented hardship. The maximum price controls, designed to make necessities affordable, instead made them unavailable. The confiscation of church lands, intended to fund government operations, instead destroyed agricultural productivity and charitable institutions that had sustained the poor for centuries. Contrast this destruction with the patient development of commercial institutions in England and America. Our commercial law evolved gradually, adapting ancient principles to new circumstances while preserving proven methods of organizing economic activity. Property rights were secured not as absolute privileges but as social trusts that enabled productive investment while recognizing obligations to the broader community. The American experiment in constitutional commerce offers particularly instructive lessons. Your founders understood that economic freedom requires legal framework, not theoretical abstraction. They created a common market among the states while preserving local authority over internal improvements. They protected contracts while enabling bankruptcy procedures. They encouraged innovation while maintaining standards of honest dealing. This approach recognizes that economic life, like political life, develops organically through the interaction of countless individual decisions within established institutional boundaries. Government's role is not to design economic outcomes but to maintain the legal framework within which productive activity can flourish. Constitutional political economy trusts the accumulated wisdom of market processes while ensuring that those processes serve broader social purposes. The French mistake was believing that economic equality could be achieved through political decree rather than evolved through improved economic institutions. They sought to redistribute existing wealth rather than create conditions for generating new wealth. They confused justice with envy, confusing legitimate concern for the poor with destructive assault on productive activity. True economic justice, as I observed during my years addressing colonial taxation, requires balancing efficiency with equity through constitutional procedures rather than revolutionary violence. Chapter 5: Religious Order and the Moral Foundations of Free Government. Perhaps no aspect of the French Revolution more clearly demonstrates the connection between constitutional order and civilized society than the systematic assault on religious institutions. The revolutionaries, convinced that reason alone could provide moral guidance, attempted to replace centuries of Christian tradition with the abstract worship of a supreme being designed by philosophical committee. They confiscated church property, exiled priests, and attempted to remake religious observance according to revolutionary calendar and ceremony. The result was not enlightened morality but moral chaos that contributed directly to the terror's brutality. This assault on religion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about the relationship between faith and freedom in constitutional government. The revolutionaries viewed religious authority as competing with popular sovereignty, failing to recognize that shared moral traditions provide the cultural foundation that makes democratic self-government possible. They confused the legitimate separation of church and state with the impossible separation of morality and politics. My own experience defending the American colonists taught me that religious liberty and constitutional government naturally support each other when properly understood. The Americans sought freedom to practice their various faiths without interference, not freedom from the moral obligations that faith imposes. They recognized that self-governing citizens require the internal moral discipline that religious tradition provides, even as they rejected any single church's claim to political authority. The English Constitution, which I spent my career defending, achieved this balance through what foreigners often misunderstood as mere pragmatic compromise. Our established church provided moral authority and national unity without suppressing the legitimate diversity of Protestant dissent. This arrangement recognized that while government cannot compel genuine faith, it can and must acknowledge the divine source of moral law that makes human law legitimate. The French revolutionaries rejected this wisdom, believing that human reason could construct moral principles as easily as mathematical theorems. They established the cult of reason and later the cult of the supreme being, artificial religions designed to serve revolutionary purposes rather than express genuine spiritual insight. These attempts failed because they confused the products of religious tradition, moral teaching, social solidarity, transcendent purpose, with religion itself. True religious liberty, as Americans have discovered, requires constitutional protection for the free exercise of faith rather than governmental hostility toward religious influence in public life. Citizens informed by religious conviction bring moral wisdom to political deliberation, provided no single religious authority can impose its specific doctrines through governmental power. The destruction of French religious institutions removed crucial barriers to unlimited state power while eliminating sources of moral authority independent of political control. Churches had provided education, charity, and moral guidance that enabled communities to maintain order without extensive governmental intervention. When these institutions were destroyed, the state had to expand its own power to perform functions previously handled by voluntary religious association. This reveals why constitutional government requires what I call the moral prejudices of a people, their inherited sense of right and wrong, duty and obligation, justice and mercy. These moral foundations cannot be manufactured by political decree but must be cultivated through religious tradition, family instruction, and community example. Chapter 6: Imperial Wisdom. Federation versus centralization in constitutional government. My decades defending the American colonists against ill-conceived imperial policies taught me invaluable lessons about the difference between wise federation and destructive centralization, lessons that illuminate why the French revolutionary experiment in unified national government proved so catastrophic. The British Empire's greatest strength lay not in uniform administration but in its ability to accommodate diverse communities within common constitutional framework. When we abandoned this principle in favor of direct parliamentary control over colonial affairs, we precipitated the very crisis that led to American independence. The French revolutionaries made precisely the opposite error. Where we had tried to impose excessive uniformity on naturally diverse communities, they attempted to eliminate all local diversity in favor of abstract national unity. They abolished the historic provinces, Normandy, Burgundy, Provence, each with distinct laws, customs, and institutions evolved over centuries to serve local needs. In their place, they created artificial departments of equal size, named after rivers and mountains rather than human communities, designed to facilitate central control rather than effective governance. This administrative revolution reveals the fundamental difference between constitutional federation and revolutionary centralization. Federation respects the natural diversity of human communities while creating common institutions to serve shared purposes. It recognizes that different regions have different needs, different traditions, different capacities that must be acknowledged rather than suppressed. Centralization, by contrast, treats diversity as an obstacle to efficiency rather than a source of strength. The American solution to this problem offers instructive contrast to French methods. Your federal constitution preserves state authority over internal affairs while creating national government strong enough to handle truly national concerns. This division of powers was not arbitrary but reflected practical understanding of which problems require uniform national treatment and which benefit from local adaptation. Commerce between states needs national regulation, education and local governance do not. My own experience with imperial administration convinced me that successful government of large territories requires what I termed salutary neglect, allowing local communities maximum freedom to govern themselves according to their own wisdom while maintaining overall constitutional unity. The attempt to micromanage colonial affairs from London proved both ineffective and destructive because it ignored the practical knowledge that only local experience provides. The French revolutionary approach represented the opposite extreme, total uniformity imposed by central authority. They believed that rational administration required identical laws, identical institutions, identical procedures throughout the territory. This approach failed because it ignored the accumulated wisdom embedded in local traditions and the practical variations that geography, history, and culture necessarily create. Constitutional federation succeeds because it channels the benefits of both local knowledge and national coordination. Local governments handle problems they understand best. National government addresses issues that require uniform treatment. This division of authority creates multiple centers of power that check each other while enabling effective governance at both levels. The revolutionaries' destruction of provincial institutions eliminated crucial buffers between individual citizens and central power. Local parliaments, regional customs, ancient corporate privileges, these had provided forums where grievances could be addressed and resistance organized when central authority exceeded proper bounds. Their elimination left individuals defensively naked before unlimited national power. True constitutional government requires institutional complexity that reflects the natural complexity of human society rather than artificial simplicity that serves administrative convenience. Chapter 7: Applying Burkean Constitutional Wisdom to American Governance. The enduring relevance of constitutional wisdom becomes most apparent when we consider how Burkean principles apply to contemporary American governance challenges. Your republic, now entering its third century, faces pressures remarkably similar to those that destroyed the French constitutional experiment: the temptation to solve complex problems through simple federal solutions, the dangerous appeal of abstract theories divorced from practical experience, and the gradual erosion of intermediate institutions that mediate between individual citizens and central power. Consider the contemporary tendency to transform every social problem into a federal constitutional issue requiring uniform national solution. This approach mirrors the French revolutionary impulse to impose rational uniformity on diverse communities rather than allowing local experimentation and adaptation. When the federal government mandates identical educational standards, healthcare procedures, or environmental regulations for communities as different as rural Montana and urban California, it repeats the French error of believing that good governance requires administrative simplicity rather than constitutional complexity. The American constitutional system was designed to avoid precisely this trap through federalism that preserves state authority over truly local concerns while enabling national coordination where genuinely necessary. Yet the gradual expansion of federal authority into areas traditionally governed by states and localities has weakened the very institutional diversity that makes your republic resilient. When every dispute becomes a federal case, you lose the benefits of the local experimentation that enables constitutional adaptation without revolutionary disruption. Similarly, the contemporary polarization of American politics reflects the dangerous influence of abstract ideological thinking over practical prudential judgment. Both progressive and conservative movements often fall into the French trap of believing that political problems yield to theoretical solutions rather than requiring the patient work of constitutional statecraft. They prefer the clarity of ideological purity to the messy compromises that effective governance demands. True constitutional conservatism, as I understand it, requires defending proven institutions while adapting them prudently to changed circumstances. This means neither rigid resistance to all change nor enthusiastic embrace of every innovation, but careful discrimination between changes that strengthen constitutional government and those that undermine it. The test is not theoretical consistency but practical effectiveness in preserving ordered liberty. Your Supreme Court, when functioning properly, exemplifies this approach by interpreting constitutional text in light of historical precedent rather than abstract theory. Yet when justices attempt to deduce constitutional meaning from philosophical first principles rather than constitutional tradition, they repeat the French error of substituting reason for experience. The gradual weakening of intermediate institutions, families, churches, voluntary associations, local governments, poses perhaps the greatest threat to American constitutional order. These institutions provide the moral formation and practical training in self-governance that Republican citizenship requires. When they weaken, citizens become more dependent on federal government while less capable of effective participation in democratic life. Constitutional renewal in America requires strengthening these mediating institutions rather than bypassing them through federal activism. This means recognizing that the health of your republic depends not primarily on federal policies but on the vitality of the countless local communities where citizens actually learn the habits of democratic participation. The path forward requires rejecting both revolutionary impatience and reactionary nostalgia in favor of prudent reform that preserves constitutional essentials while adapting institutional forms to contemporary challenges. This is the true Burkean approach: conservation through careful change rather than preservation through rigid resistance. Conclusion. The lessons of the French Revolution echo through every generation that faces the eternal choice between constitutional wisdom and revolutionary folly. What destroyed France was not popular government itself but the systematic destruction of every constitutional barrier that protects popular government from its own excesses. The revolutionaries believed they could perfect human society through pure reason and unlimited will, yet they succeeded only in demonstrating why constitutional order matters more than constitutional theory. Your American experiment offers a different model: revolution that preserved rather than destroyed constitutional tradition, change that strengthened rather than shattered the institutional foundations of free government. Yet this achievement requires constant vigilance against the temptations that destroyed French liberty: the appeal of simple solutions to complex problems, the dangerous belief that good intentions justify unlimited power, and the fatal attraction of abstract theory over practical experience. Constitutional government survives not through the perfection of its institutions but through their prudent adaptation to changing circumstances. It requires citizens who understand that freedom is not the absence of restraint but the presence of just law, representatives who serve the public good rather than merely popular will, and leaders who exercise power within constitutional limits even when those limits frustrate immediate desires. The choice before every free people remains the same: will you preserve the difficult achievement of constitutional liberty through patient reform, or will you risk everything on the revolutionary promise of perfection through power? The French made their choice and reaped the whirlwind. Choose more wisely.